It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eugene Hattori, who is the Curator of Anthropology at the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. Many of you are familiar with Gene, who has spoken at previous docent council meetings and locally on the topics of ancient basketry, of the Great Basin, stone tool use, the explorer John C. Fremont, and Asians in Nevada. Today, he will share with us his knowledge of petroglyphs at the Winnemucca Lake site. Who knew how old they would turn out to be? Here to explain this story, please welcome Dr. Eugene Hattori.
Thank you, Linda. And we had no idea for decades how old these particular petroglyphs were. I had first learned about it through actually Dr. LaRivers at UNR when I was probably in junior high school, and a very well-known site to many people in Nevada. The site is on the Pyramid Lake Indian Reservation and is not open to the public. One of the things I want to do is give credit to the senior author and the principal investigator for the project, and that's Dr. Larry Benson, who retired from the U.S. Geological Survey in Boulder, Colorado, and now he's affiliated with not only USGS, but University of Colorado, Boulder. The research that we conducted was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2013, and that was some 2 years after we initiated the project. And the way that this project started is Larry had a long-term career oriented toward Tufa studies in the former Lake Lahontan basin. And Lake Lahontan was the glacial lake that occurred in the western part of the Great Basin, and its sister lake, Lake Bonneville, in the eastern part of the Great Basin. So instead of continental glaciers in our region, we had pluvial lakes throughout the basin itself, and in the mountain ranges, we had mountain glaciers. Lake Lahontan was actually a chain of lakes interconnected. 7 lake basins were defined as the constituent parts of Lake Lahontan, and these were joined by water channels. They were joined to each other at different elevations. They would fill, depending on which water source, the Humboldt drainage system or the Sierra Nevada drainages, they would fill differentially until the lake reached a certain level. And these lakes were joined by spill points. So one lake basin would fill and then start spilling into an adjacent lake basin until the maximum elevation is what's depicted on that particular slide. The research area is the Winnemucca Lake subbasin, but we refer to it as the Pyramid Lake subbasin. So it's Pyramid and Winnemucca Lake. And here is a map of more or less how it appears today. And the threshold for Winnemucca Lake was the Mud Lake Slough, and that's a water channel that went from the Truckee River into Winnemucca Lake. And when either Pyramid Lake reached an elevation of 1,177 meters, or the Truckee River reached an elevation of 1,177 meters, water started spilling over into the Mud Lake Slough, and that's when Winnemucca Lake filled. That was curtailed, of course, with the Newlands irrigation project, when over 50% of the Truckee River's flow was diverted into the Lahontan Basin. But you'll notice on the slide that there's 2 other thresholds that are of interest. And these are the spill points or thresholds for the Winnemucca and Pyramid Lake basins draining into the Smoke Creek and desert. And Emerson Pass threshold is the one of interest to us for the petroglyph study, and that's at 1,207 meters. The Astor Pass threshold is at 1,222 meters, and that's a maximum lake stand. The Winnemucca Lake slough, Mud Lake Slough, is represented on the pyramid by the bench at the bottom of the pyramid. And that actually is at 1,177 meters. And it is also more or less the high lake stand during the historic period. And that's in the 1880s. Winnemucca Lake reached its maximum lake stand after probably being dry earlier in the 19th century. When Lake Lahontan was at its maximum elevation, just the very tip of Anaho Island stuck above Lake Lahontan. And we can see, this is a slide of the Carson Desert area. This is from Simpson Pass, looking into the Carson Lake area, and Wildcat Rim is off to the left there. You'll see the strand lines on the side of the hill on the right there, and that represents different lake stands for Lake Lahontan. So when Lake Lahontan was filling, it would reach a threshold, and then the lake would be at that elevation for a while until the adjoining basin filled, and the two basins would start filling until they reached a threshold and start filling the next basin in line. And what would happen during the periods where the lake was spilling over, you would have beaches formed, or these terraces formed. And that's what you see represented as what we call strand lines in the hillside there in the Boonjug Mountains. This is looking from the petroglyph site out into the Winnemucca Lake Basin. So you can see there's some elevation associated with the petroglyph site above the lake basin, bottom there. And you'll also see some historic strand lines from the 1880s high stand of Winnemucca Lake, represented by the vegetation, the curved concentric lines represented by different beaches that formed as Winnemucca Lake was, in this instance, probably drying up. This is one of Larry's publications that's available online on the Tufas of Pyramid Lake, and that figures in greatly with the petroglyph study that we undertook for the age dating the petroglyphs. Basically, what we have represented for the Tufa site that the petroglyphs are carved into, at one time it was a giant tower or mound, as you see depicted on the lower right-hand slide there. And what those were, they represent springs emptying into the bottom of ancient Lake Lahontan. So as the springs were emptying into the bottom of Lake Lahontan, they were carrying dissolved minerals from their sources up in the mountains, and they would be deposited slowly, gradually through time. And it would form these calcium carbonate minerals. And in this instance, you can see the water channel right where it says T in the upper left-hand side. It's hollow. And on the inside of that, there's a deposit of thinolite tufa. And surrounding that are rings of dense tufa. And so as it is debauching into the bottom of Lake Lahontan, the tufa is being formed from the inside as well as the outside. And the coral-like tufa that many of us are familiar with at Pyramid Lake is branching tufa. And it's actually through the branching tufa that the petroglyphs were carved. So if you can imagine a larger mound than this, represented by the next, well, actually, here's a close-up of the algal or branching tufa. And again, this is where basically spring water came up from the bottom of Lake Lahontan and ended up forming this pillar of tufa. This is a site where the petroglyphs are carved, and it was one time a giant tufa mound that has since sometime after basically 15,000 years ago kind of fell apart. And you see the remnants as the shell of the branching tufa is what stands out in this photo. And the other forms of tufa from the inside is the rubble that you see in between the plates of the branching tufa. We're going to do a close-up of this area. There's a 6 feet, 2 meter scale. And now you can see the petroglyphs. And again, these are on the branching tufa, carved very deeply and carved in place. So after the mound collapsed somewhat, the petroglyphs were carved into these remnants of the tufa mound. We'll be contrasting those petroglyphs with the petroglyphs that we know from throughout the Great Basin. And these are very shallow pecked images that go through the patina of, in this instance, basalt, and very shallow and not well weathered. That's another thing that we look for in determining the relative age of petroglyphs, is how much weathering we have in the carved or chipped areas. This is tufa out at Winnemucca Lake, and this is some of the branching tufa, but you can see a later petroglyph that was pecked into the tufa. So the later people followed the same pattern that we see with the basalt petroglyph that you saw earlier, and it's very shallow. It's pretty much still, you can see some of the spaces that the branching tufa has in its basic structure. Put this slide in to show you that the earlier folks pecked very deeply into the branching tufa, and they went so deep that they actually punched out holes in the tufa. So for whatever reason, they kept pecking on these images, either when they're formed or possibly through a period of time. But they eventually pecked through that outer layer of branching tufa into the other forms of tufa beneath it. So what happened for us to discover this? Larry, after he retired, would take his friends and colleagues from Colorado or elsewhere in the Southwest and bring them out, in this instance, to the Great Basin, and show them some of his research areas. And part of his tour was to line up with his other friends and have them give local side tours of interesting sites, in this instance, the petroglyphs at Winnemucca Lake. So I arranged with the Pyramid Lake Cultural Center for us to go out there. And I was giving the tour to Larry's friends from USGS and archaeologists from National Park Service, a tour of the petroglyphs. And Larry had been on this, and I had given tours for Larry before. And Larry just stood back and did his own thing. And we went out and looked at the petroglyphs throughout that mound. And Larry happened to notice these petroglyphs. And what he noticed that many of us would not notice is that there's a difference in the color of the tufa. You can see that it's kind of bleached white at the bottom, and then it's the regular natural tannish color on top. And actually, upon closer inspection, Larry looked at that, and that was actually a calcium carbonate coating on the petroglyphs, over the petroglyphs. And that really was a surprise to Larry. And it indicated that after these petroglyphs were carved into the tufa, the lake rose and covered the tufa and deposited basically a hard water deposit over the tufa. And at that time, he actually was able to figure out that where the tufa changed from light to dark, and it doesn't show up that well, but the lower part is the part that is covered with calcium carbonate over the grooves of the carved tufa, was at about 1,207 meters. And 1,207 meters is the spill point or threshold for Winnemucca Lake draining through the Emerson Pass outlet. And so as Winnemucca Lake covered the tufa petroglyphs and water started spilling over the threshold, it stayed at that elevation long enough for the calcium carbonate to cover the petroglyphs. And that's of great interest because it means that when Lake Lahontan, this is our Ice Age lake, our Pleistocene lake, was filling with water at some point, the petroglyphs, existing petroglyphs, were being submerged. That meant people were here at the time that Lake Lahontan was here. What that entailed was getting a radiocarbon date on the calcium carbonate that was covering the tufa, which is also calcium carbonate. And this is Larry's specialty. And he went before the tribal council and proposed a study of age dating the petroglyphs at Winnemucca Lake, and was given permission to do so as long as we did not sample within the actual petroglyph itself. So we had to sample off of the boulders where the petroglyphs were carved, which at the time seemed like no problem whatsoever. This is Larry at the key site where the calcium carbonate, where you notice the calcium carbonate coating the petroglyphs. And if you look at this set of petroglyphs, you'll see that the top portion in the darker colored tufa is not covered very much at all, whereas the bottom set of petroglyphs are pretty well covered by a layer or several layers of calcium carbonate. And that's the key elevation right there. And that's where we sampled above and below those two arrows. His GPS reading at that site, that locality, was 1,206 meters, with the threshold he measured at 1,207 meters for Emerson Pass at Pyramid Lake. So again, there's the thresholds, 1177 for Mud Lake Slough and 1207 for Emerson Pass. Mud Lake Slough, 1177, water enters Winnemucca Lake. 1207, water starts spilling over into actually 1,207 meters. Emerson Pass, the water is leaving the Pyramid Lake, Winnemucca Lake subbasins. And it would maintain that level about 1,207 meters until the next basin fills with water. This is a sampling, beginning of the sampling. And again, moving off the site The petroglyphs are around the boulder there, and Larry is drilling out cores that he would take back to Boulder and dissect layer after layer. And radiocarbon date, John Southan from UC Irvine did the radiocarbon dating, would date the calcium, the carbon in the calcium carbonate. These are the results on the bottom there. Actually we had 12, 2, 4, 6, 7. We had at least seven dates. And the dates above there are from Larry's earlier work throughout the Winnemucca Lake subbasin. And this is a graphic representation of the radiocarbon data. And to simplify that even further, the area in blue beneath the dotted line more or less represents the lake elevation, with the elevations on the left-hand side there. The blue represents when water was in the Winnemucca Lake basin, and the approximate elevation by the dotted lines. And the red arrow on the left at 1,205 meters represents the approximate elevation of the petroglyphs, as well as the Emerson Pass spill point or threshold. So if we look at that, the blue represents water covering the site. Brown represents when the area would be dry and available for the Native Americans to carve the petroglyphs. So we see that on the left-hand side there, the CC is the carbonate coating or carbonate crust that we know covers the petroglyphs. And we have a period where Winnemucca Lake was below that 1,205 meter elevation. And that was between 10,500 years ago and 11,300 years ago. So that's when the petroglyphs could have been carved. However, we also found that there was another period when the petroglyphs could have been carved, and that wasn't evident just looking at the petroglyphs themselves. But the cores revealed that there was another period between 13,200 and 14,800 years ago when the lake had fallen in elevation quite drastically. And that if people would come in when the lake was so dry, they could have carved the petroglyphs. Another thing to note is the elevation shown in blue of Winnemucca Lake and how dramatically it fell from that time of about 15,000 years ago. Actually, the Tufa mound itself was dated at 14,800 years ago. So it formed during the last stand of Lake Lahontan, and then the lake crashed, and the climate probably got warmer and drier, and not a good time for people to live there. And in fact, if we look at the radiocarbon dates from archaeological sites in the Winnemucca, Pyramid Lake, and Grimes Point area, we see that we don't have any dates that go back over about 11,400, 11,200 years ago. And we have nothing when this paper was written older than that. So our conclusion for the paper was the petroglyphs were carved most likely 10,500 to 11,300 years ago. And that seemed to fit the data that we had at that time, until Evan Pellegrini, who's now a archaeologist with Nevada Department of Transportation, found this plastic bag full of grasshopper parts. take a close look at that, and you can see a lot of grasshopper legs that are very identifiable there. Their hind leg there. And Evan, who's also interested in the natural history, wanted to study this particular collection. He was working for us at that time as an hourly employee, doing inventory of our collections. And so the Bureau of Land Management, who manages this particular Winnemucca Lake site called Crypt Cave, actually funded a radiocarbon date for the grasshoppers when they were buried in a cache in this archaeological site, Crypt Cave. The date came back and it blew our minds. It was 14,200 years before present. And that date happened to match some actually relatively recent dates from the Paisley Caves in South Central Oregon that came back showing human occupation of the Paisley Caves 14,200 years ago, and matched those dates. Although we don't have any artifacts associated with this particular cache, we do have the pit itself, which was excavated into the cave floor from the cultural deposits into lake deposits. So when that cave was being formed by lake action, the beach sands were deposited, and then people actually, we have a period where Pleistocene animals occupied the cave, and then that's 20,000 years ago. And then we had humans come in later, dug a cache pit to store their grasshoppers for later use in the bottom of the cave some 14,200 years ago. Evan calculated the minimum number of individuals at, I believe, something around 700 grasshoppers. So we add another point on that earlier graph that we published back in 2013. And we see that 14,200 years ago, the people that occupied Crypt Cave could have also carved the petroglyphs, because the petroglyphs were not, the petroglyph boulders were not submerged by Lake Lahontan water at that time. These are the some of the grasshopper parts that turns out to be an extinct locust that was a plague locust of the 19th century. And this is the Rocky Mountain locust that became extinct right around the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries. And probably as a result of the settlers, farmers, plowing up the areas where these particular locusts bred. Some 14,200 years ago, there was a plague of locusts over Winnemucca Lake, and the Native Americans took advantage of the plague and harvested the locusts, which are grasshoppers. These are some of the early artifacts that were radiocarbon dated. In this instance, this is one of the Spirit Cave bags from Grimes Point area, and it's over 10,000 years in age. And then from Winnemucca Lake, from actually from Empire Cave at Falcon Hill, we have, and I believe this to be a fragment of a bag that we dated at 9,500 years in age. And here's a sandal from the Black Rock Desert area that also is about 9,400 years in age. And these are all part of the ancient early Holocene culture that we find in this region. We unfortunately didn't find any of these in situ or in place, but these are some of the artifacts from this region that are associated with the 12 to 13, and on the far right there, that stem point could possibly be as old as 14,000 years ago. The fluted points on the left, the two fluted points on the left, elsewhere have been generally dated to about 12 to 13,000 years in age. If we take a look at some of the petroglyphs, just looking at the designs, we did not interpret the designs, did not read the petroglyphs. And there's two schools, basic schools. Some people believe they can interpret the petroglyphs, and others believe that we really can't get into the meaning of the petroglyphs other than the obvious. This represents a bighorn sheep, or this represents a human with a bow and arrow. But these are, in my mind, we can't really figure out what they were thinking when they carved these petroglyphs. However, there was a paper published on these petroglyphs where they were read or interpreted. And the authors of that paper thought that they represented, they were water-centric, that they represented rain and other meteorological phenomena. And they occur throughout, not only on the eastward facing side of the mound, but they occur throughout the mound itself. You can see why people are tempted to interpret these things. On the left there, they may have interpreted that as a rainbow, and they had lightning and they had rainfall represented in the petroglyphs here. And these are very deeply carved, and actually looking at them right now, they look like they've been recarved too. They've been enhanced after they were initially carved. And the petroglyph is on the left-hand side there, but showing some of the lichen that forms over the petroglyphs. And again, that's another sign of relative age on these petroglyphs, some of these petroglyphs. That circle with the squiggly line is a very large oversized, that's a meter-long stick there. We see that same design that looks like a spring symbol on USGS topographic maps. We see that much smaller scale in later petroglyphs. And it's a very distinctive design, and we do see it later on in time. So there might be some cultural connection somehow related to that particular motif. The Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs at 14,200 years before present were at that time the oldest that we knew about. And prior to that, there was a site in South Central Oregon at Long Lake above, it'd be on the eastern side of Warner Valley in the Heart Mountain area. And this is Long Lake, and it has a rim or a cliff face there that goes for about a mile. And that thing, not constant, but throughout that mile exposure, the rock face is, or faces are just filled with panels of petroglyph. Just an amazing sight. And there are some cultural features above the rim, and the focus of the occupation there at Long Lake was a what is now a little basin, a little dry lake, a playa, that in times past probably not only held water, which it still does today on occasion, and there are some camas that does grow out there from time to time, but there was probably some wetland formation there during times of increased precipitation, reduced evaporation. So it's a good place to live. Here are some of the Long Lake petroglyphs. These are the later style, and we see different degrees of patination for the petroglyphs there. So we know they've been doing these sorts of petroglyphs for probably many thousands of years, and they're typical of Great Basin petroglyphs that we see elsewhere, shallow. And if you look in the top center there, you can see a little critter with 3 toes and 4 legs. And we see, not uncommonly in this region, as well as down here too, lizard motifs. And that one particularly is interesting because it has a little design, some circles pecked in its back. My friend and colleague, Bill Cannon, who was with the Bureau of Land Management at the time, and still is a petroglyph nut, has been recording petroglyphs throughout the region for decades. 3 decades, about 3 decades to be exact, as the Lakeview District BLM archaeologist, and he's recently retired. He came across this particular alcove in the cliff and noticed that there were some of the interesting petroglyphs above ground, and he looked and noticed that some of the petroglyphs were descending into the floor of the shelter there. And he kicked the dirt a little bit and noticed that the dirt was actually pure white below the surface. And so he came back later and conducted an archaeological excavation to expose the petroglyphs that were buried, and found, as you can see, and he dug down. This is some of the backfilled area. He dug down. The petroglyphs keep going down, but they were covered by this layer of white volcanic ash. And this was pure white volcanic ash. And he had it analyzed, and what it turned out to be was primary ashfall from the Mount Mazama eruption. And the Mount Mazama volcano erupted 7,800 years ago and formed Crater Lake. It actually erupted several times around 7,800 years ago and formed Crater Lake. And that gives a minimum date for those petroglyphs at 7,800 years before present. And what's particularly interesting about the petroglyphs is they're deeply carved. And this is deeply carved in basalt rather than tufa. Tufa is a relatively soft rock, and basalt is not. It's hard. And that took quite a bit of effort to carve those particular petroglyphs. This is a panel with the deeply carved petroglyphs from Long Lake. And in looking at this, and Bill noted this years and years ago, these petroglyphs look a lot like the Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs, both in motifs represented, as well as the depth, relative depth, relative scale, and the spacing of the elements on the rock art panel. These are cupules, and they are a little bit different in some respects from other cupuled rock art that we see, in that these are on basically a vertical surface. We see cupules on, not uncommonly, on boulders, and they were probably used as grinding mortars, miniature mortars for grinding pigment or herbs or something like that. But in this instance, cupules form a design on a vertical surface. And this is Winnemucca Lake with these cupules. And here's Long Lake in Oregon with cupules on a vertical surface. And this is on an exposed surface and greatly weathered. So those were all individual cups, individual mortar-like cups pecked on into the basalt face there. And there's some more cupules, but in this instance, out at Grimes Point site. And again, not on a very functional surface, on a more or less a vertical surface. Another thing that we see with these early petroglyphs are these troughs that are pecked into the rock, into the boulder. In this instance, you can see the vertical trough there. Sometimes they're horizontal, and Alvin McLean did a study on some of the mortar pits that we see on these boulders and the troughs, trying to interpret what was going on with them, if they were indeed functional. And the one that he tested at Lahontan Reservoir was, you could pour water into a mortar pit at the top of the boulder, and it would flow down the channel into another mortar pit, and so on and so forth, along the ridge of a boulder. Very common design that we see with these older petroglyphs that are deeply incised are these chevrons, with that central line there, kind of a pine tree or or conifer or a fish skeleton type design. And we see that after we publish the paper, it occurs throughout the West, from Southern California to Northern California and elsewhere in Oregon. You can see the chevron designs off to the left there on this particular panel. Here's the carbonate coated petroglyphs, the shallow bars, vertical bars with a space in between at Winnemucca Lake. And if you look at the top of the boulder here, or the rock face here, you can see the similar sort of vertical bar design. And the concentric circle here, we also saw at Long Lake. And that actually is not an uncommon design that we see later in time too, concentric circles. And we don't have it here, but spires are another common element that we see. There's another, this is from Long Lake. Here's some of the petroglyphs. You can barely make them out on the left-hand side there that are encrusted with a calcium carbonate, but you can see the ones on the right post-date those, but they're still of the same style as the calcium carbonate coated petroglyphs. So somebody came in after these petroglyphs were pecked or carved and coated with the calcium carbonate. Water level went back down. Later people came in and carved petroglyphs, possibly recovering some earlier petroglyphs or carving new petroglyphs on the same face as the older carvings. That's pretty much where we stand right now. After the paper was published, we received emails that told us about other sites, again, from Southern California to Northern California, and not clearly associated with any particular time period, but we believe that this was an older culture that occupied the Western US and the Great Basin in particular. So I'm ready to answer any questions that you might have regarding our research.
That was very, very interesting, very informative, and how exciting to think of something as 14,000 years ago, that having people present. Really wonderful. I have a question because at first I didn't realize or didn't understand what tofu is. I was going to say tofu. Tofu. Is it similar to coral under the sea, or is it something different? Well, I mean, it's not as fragile.
Yeah, there's different forms of tufa, and there's crystalline forms that can form actually even below the mud at the bottom of a lake, as well as the accretional tufa that forms along the water pipes, let's say, of the springs that come out of the bottom of the lake. And then the third type that the petroglyphs were carved into, the branching tufa, was probably deposited, well, they believe it's deposited by algae. So algae starts forming on the outside of these tufa pipes, the harder tufa pipes, and the algae deposits calcium carbonate and forms that coral-like surface. So it's a plant-based mineral versus coral, which is an animal-based mineral.
How long did it take for the water to deposit the material on top of the petroglyph? It survived, and you said that how long you found the deposits on top. So how long did the water have to last above it?
That'd be a better question for Larry, because he is a geochemist.
Right.
And it depends on the concentration of the dissolved calcium carbonate in the water, as well as whether the lake is filling at a fast rate or a slow lake as it spills over into the adjoining basin. So you really, or I don't think, in my mind, I don't know that you could calibrate how long it takes to deposit without without knowing the water chemistry. However, that's what we're trying to do. What Larry does is he peels back the individual layers, and sometimes there aren't distinct layers, so he'll just go down just a few microns, let's say, and date individual bands as he uses his Dremel to go through his sample, his core sample.
How spaced were the dry periods? Can you determine that in the study between the spills over these?
Yeah, and that they can last. Well, in this instance, we had the dates where they lasted several thousand years, but even within a dry period, actually, we had another lake form after the end of the Ice Age. A fairly major lake formed at Winnemucca Lake that is above the traditional levels about 8,000 years ago. And that was from that sample pillar, that sample tower, Tufa Tower, that that I showed a picture of with Larry standing as a little person at the base of, that he really didn't, was a little bit of a surprise to him how deep that particular lake was. So they can be short periods or they can be long periods. And within that great drought period, when the grasshoppers were collected, there undoubtedly, even though it geologically, his interpretation originally was that there was no water in the Winnemucca Lake Basin during that long dry period from about 14,500 years ago, that there was no water in the basin, but we know people were there now with the grasshoppers, and there was probably a lake there. Shallow lake, and shallow lakes are better in some of these playa lake basins because the marshes form. And I got a lot of nice sediment from the lake beds there. So varying in time, but sometimes a long time. And surprisingly, for that one drought from about 14,500 or so years ago, happened really quickly and very dramatically.
You showed us some arrows, 3 arrows, and you said none of them have been found in the areas that you were involved with. But are you assuming that those stone arrows were what was used to carve the tufa?
No, nope. Okay. And actually,
So
the way those petroglyphs were carved, and some of the tools are still there. They would use.
My sound went out.
Oh, some of the tools that they used are still at the site, and they would peck and groove. So you'd peck and it'd be a harder rock, let's say a piece of basalt, or that's pretty much the common rock in that particular side of the Winnemucca Lake Basin. And you would peck at the rock, you would hit it repeatedly in one area, and then you could scrape it with the rock and form those grooves. But you'd have to do it pretty constantly. It'd take a little bit of effort, even though the rock is soft.
Some of the drawings were reinforced or have been worked over. I don't know what the term you used.
Yeah.
Could it be told whether a different tool was used to do that rework on it?
You know, you might be able to in some instances. We have some petroglyphs that are actually scratched into the rock surface, but not out here.
Okay.
Most of these were just, you know, you look at it and it's a groove, it's a trough, and it's smooth.
One of the photos you showed us, it almost looked like they were going for a face on the rock, it was a gigantic rock, and it looked like it had teeth at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And it looked like it had a facial structure. Have you actually seen that rock before? And is there a face being built out of that great big stone?
Yeah, and that's one of the comments that we got, not uncommonly, was that, hey, you missed that is such and such a creature. And one of the commenters said, it's obviously what you have represented there was a thunderbird. And again, it's up to the viewer to interpret what they see. And unless it's really obvious, I'm not making any guesses as to what the petroglyph represents.
The tufa is so fragile. How do they last so long? Thousands of years.
Yeah, it's amazing that they do. And that's a really good question. And it just is the environment that they're in. And we've probably lost a number of them, either through erosion or through them falling down and being buried. It's just Nevada is amazing in terms of preservation. And you saw the sandal and the basketry, basketry, the bag. It's just that Nevada is blessed that it has such good environmental conditions.
Is most of the tufa on reservation land?
A third of the lake shore, and it'd be the southwestern side of Winnemucca Lake is on the Pyramid Lake Indian Reservation.
Because I have seen tufa at auctions where people were bidding on a beautiful piece of tufa.
Illegal on the reservation to collect tufa.
Illegal, okay.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And next one, we have the Truckee River watershed. So something else a little different, a little geological as well. So see you all then. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.